I've never painted any Underworlds models before, but then I went to my local game shop and I saw these guys, these little rats called Skabbik's Plaguepack. And to be honest, I always wanted to have an excuse to paint up some Skaven, even though I don't actually own a Skaven army, because they are so fun and disgusting at the same time. So in today's video I'm going to be painting these guys up and try to make them more colorful than the original box art, and I'll introduce a couple more colors as well to make them my own.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Fallon's Miniatures.
And in the first half of the video I'm going to be using contrast paints only to establish all the base colors, so if you just want to have these guys painted up relatively fast, you can follow along until that point. But if you're ready to spend a little bit more time on these little rats, which they definitely deserve with how detailed they are, then you can just follow the second half of the video where I'll be highlighting them up to a higher standard with regular acrylics.
I started out by priming them black as always, and I'm using an airbrush here, but you can of course use a black primer from a can as well, it would work just as well. The next step was a white zenithal highlight from above. And once again you can replicate this with a rattle can as well, just spray them from the top with a white primer. Just make sure that you go quite heavy with this zenithal so that the top of the model is fully white at the end, completely covering it. This is so that I can take advantage of the contrast colors I'm going to be using, because those really need a bright undercoat to function. And you might be thinking that you can just prime the whole model white and just keep these steps, and you might be right actually, you can do that, but then you are not going to end up with the same result, because this is going to create some really nice transitions from the get-go on the model that you are not going to have if everything is white. Using a zenithal highlight means that the top of the model is going to be the most highlighted and the most vibrant in colors, whereas the underside is going to be in shadow. So that means that the whole thing looks way more 3D when you look at it than something that was just primed white. The model should look something like this after the priming step.
With all the priming and zenithal highlighting done, let's start working on those colors.
And let's start with the robes, because those are the biggest part of the model. This is going to define how the overall color scheme is going to look like. And I decided to go for the obvious here, which is Plaguebearer's flesh. It kind of has this in the name, it's about plague, exactly like these guys are. But at the same time, it also has a lot of yellow and a lot of green in it. So it has this original greenishness that we saw in the color scheme, but it can be much brighter and much more vibrant because of all the yellow. As always with contrast paints, I used a big brush, size 3 from Artis Opus, and a lot of paint, flooding the surface as much as I can. It's always better to use more paint than necessary, because then you can soak up the excess, rather than use less paint than necessary, because then you're just going to have a lot of blotchiness and not so good coverage. If you're fine with a less saturated look, then you can just go and apply a single coat, but what I wanted to do is have a lot of color on these guys, so I ended up using 2 coats once the first one dried. You can see the difference between a model with just a single coat and a model with 2 coats quite obviously here. And this is how they should look like once you are done with the robes. These guys are nicely covered in those robes, but there are still some body parts sticking out, so let's paint those. And most of those body parts that are sticking out are actually kind of hairless, except the small rat, or big rat, depending on how you want to look at it. That guy has all his fur, but the rest of the rats are mostly just the things that are hairless, I suppose because they are plagued and diseased. So I decided to just use Guilliman's flesh for now on all these parts. Speaking of body parts, all of these guys also have a nice big rat tail sticking out from the back of the robe. I guess that's not so surprising considering that these are big rats. But that also means that this is worth emphasizing because it's different, because the rest of these guys are covered in robes so much that you might be mistaking them for a normal human, but no normal human would have a big rat tail sticking out from the back. So instead of just using Guilliman's flesh like on the other parts of the body, I used Volupus pink here to make it stand out. For the body of the big rat, well, it's actually a small rat compared to the rest of the guys, I used the obvious choice once again, which is Rattling Grime. I think it's worth mentioning that you might be making mistakes here when you are applying the paint, especially because ideally you are using a big brush. And ideally you should avoid making these mistakes as much as possible, of course, because you might be ruining some of the zenithal highlights if you try to correct it, but you can and you should actually correct them as well. So if you manage to get some color where it shouldn't be, then you just take something that is close to white, ideally not a pure white, but maybe an off-white like I did, and simply correct it by painting over it. As you can see, slowly the white disappears around the model, so it's time to paint some of the base as well. I used Basilicanum Grey for all the stone parts. But I didn't only use it for the stones, I also used it for all the metal bits. One of the advantages of a zenithal highlight is that using Basilicanum Grey over something that was highlighted like this, you can actually achieve a really basic non-metallic metal look, so you don't actually have to use true metallic metals if you don't want to. But if you prefer a true metallic look, then you can simply undercoat all of these parts into Leadbelcher. For all the wood elements, I use Sigurd brown. This is a very deep brown, meaning that ideally you want to highlight it later on. If you don't want to highlight the model, just want to use contrast paint, I would suggest to use something that is a bit lighter. I suppose Gorgonta fur would actually be a good one for this. Similarly to how I use Basilicanum Grey for all the iron or steel parts, I used Gryph-hound Orange for everything that was supposed to be bronze. And once again, if you don't like non-metallics, then you can just use any true metallic bronze here as well, and that would work. I used Snakebite Leather for some of the pouches and the big book that one of the rats is holding. Then I use Skeleton Horde on some of the nails, the fangs, and these horns, I guess, that are jutting out of their backs. Probably my favorite rat is this dude with all the bandages and with this big flail, and I thought that these bandages need to be quite desaturated, so instead of using a nice saturated contrast paint on them, I used a normal shade, which is Agrax Earthshade. I'm getting closer and closer to having everything covered, but there are still quite a few details left, so let's go with the warpstone that some of these guys have on them. Believe it or not, Orcfresh was the perfect color for this. So far I haven't touched one of the biggest elements that some of these models have. The toxic fume and smoke that these guys are using, I suppose, to spread their plague and pestilence is green on the original key art, but I wanted to have something that contrasts with the robes. I don't think you can ever go wrong with a greenish yellowish tone and a purple tone together. They just go hand in hand, so let's use that. I needed something that doesn't have good coverage because I wanted to keep the top of the fumes or the smoke whitish, whereas I wanted to have everything in the crevices and at the bottom half to be more purple. So I used watered down Magos Purple on the top side of the fume and then some just out of the hot Magos Purple on some of the underside and the back side of it. It's better to go easy on this one for the first try and then add additional layers later on if you feel that you want to have a little bit more purple on it, because otherwise you might be just completely obscuring the white parts, which is not ideal. You can also add additional layers towards the source of the smoke so that it becomes a nice transition from a darker to a whiter smoke as it disperses. Two of the models also have some additional elements on the base, which is something like a sludge coming out of the sewers. Here I wanted to represent something that is toxic and green but not as bright as, let's say, the Warpstone, and something that doesn't compete with the brightness of the overall model. And I achieved it with a mixture of Black Legion and Adari Emerald. And with that I was almost done. I just added a couple of small details here and there. For example, I actually painted the noses of all of these guys white and then used Volupus pink on it. I just wanted to have something to catch the eye on their faces. And as the final touch, I use Briar Queen Chill on the eyes as well as these sores that are on some of the models. Using a blue tone here might be a bit weird, but I think it contrasts nicely with the rest of the colors, and it conveys especially well that some of these rats are blind and something is covering their eye.
And with that, all the base coats are done, and honestly, at this stage, you might even be happy with the models as they are. But even if you don't want to go further with the highlights, there is one more thing that you can do with contrast paints to make them look way better.
The idea is the following. I want to highlight the robes even further to create more contrast and also more color and a bit more visual interest on those robes. So I mixed up a little bit of the original color, which is Plaguebearer's flesh, with Gorgonta fur. The reason why I'm using Gorgonta fur here is because it's a nice brownish reddish color. So what this does is that it creates a really nice contrast between the green and the red that is in this color. But at the same time, while I'm painting this onto the underside of the robes especially, it also creates this idea that the robes are stained and dirty. Instead of using this mix as a normal contrast paint flooding the surface, I'm actually using it more like as a glaze. So I watered it down on the wet palette and I'm applying it very thinly and wait until the layer dries and then go in and paint another layer but focusing on a smaller surface. I also don't paint anything on the top side of the robes. I only focus on the underside or towards the edges. As you move down the robe and you are applying this on a smaller and smaller surface, it becomes darker and darker. So at some point you might just switch over to pure Gorgonta fur rather than the mix. And if you see that there is a harsh dividing line between the two layers, the one that you're painting on with this one and the original Plaguebearer's flesh on the robe, then you can just feather it out. Meaning that while the paint is still wet on the model, you take a little bit of water on your brush, just a tiny bit, and then you smudge the line between the original layer and the new glaze. Other than that, just make sure that you always move the paint from the top to the bottom, so you always end your brush stroke lower than where you started it. And also, very important, just be patient, wait until the previous layer dries and then apply a new one. If you just smudge into the previous layer and it reactivates the paint, you're just going to have a bunch of blotches on the model. Just apply a layer on one model and go to the next one and the next one, and by the time you go back to the original one, first in line, the paint would have already dried. It took me around 20 minutes to do this on all the models, and the end result I think looks much better than the original, just plain Plaguebearer's flesh.
Alright, with that the contrast colors are truly done, and it's time to switch over to normal acrylics to start the highlights.
Let's go back to the robes again. They already look pretty cool, right? Because they have this transition from this reddish color towards green and yellow, but we can go a bit further than that. The ideal color to highlight this is something that is both green and yellow, just like the original color of the robe. I use pistachio for making it interactive, but you can also use something else that fulfills the same requirement, so green and yellow. And then all you need to do is to highlight all the edges of the robe. The sculpt is beautifully done and there is a lot of sculpted elements, so it's relatively easy to do this. Other than the edges, you can also go for some of the elements on the robes that are the most yellow, which is usually on the very top of the model. For example, I also use it to emphasize some of the folds on his shoulders. Just be mindful that if you are using this on the edges, you can get away with using relatively thick paint, and you probably should because it makes it easier to cover the edges. But when you are painting over the actual robe, when you are emphasizing some of the folds, you might want to thin your paint a bit more, because if it's too thick, it's gonna contrast too harshly with the original contrast paint. The next color I used was lemon yellow, so very, very luminous, bright yellow. I used it on only some of the edges and some of the folds that I highlighted with the previous color, and I made sure that I stayed within the same highlights that I already created with the previous one. Finally, I used a little bit of ice yellow to highlight only some of the edges, especially the ones that are the most prominent, the most upward facing. Just be extremely sparing with this color because it has a lot of white in it, so if you cover too many of the edges, you are going to lose the previous colors that you established and make the whole thing too desaturated. For the skin, I started my highlighting with saddle brown, which is actually quite dark, but the Guilliman's flesh leaves behind a really dark undertone on a zenithal highlighted surface. And then, instead of switching to multiple different colors, I wanted to maintain this tone, so I started to mix in more and more of ice yellow into the saddle brown to create my highlights. And with the later colors, I was focusing on mostly the raised surfaces, so the knuckles, the tendons that are sticking out on the hand and stuff like that. I use the same color to highlight the face as well, including the little hairs that are sticking out around the eyes and on the nose as well. When I said that the brown of the wood is a bit dark, now it's time to lighten it up and give it a little bit of color. I use deep brown as my first highlight, and I use this to highlight every little thing on the wood. It has a ton of sculpted elements on it. Actually, if you look closely, even the grain of the wood is sculpted in. Initially, I thought that I would have to draw in the grain of the wood with just tiny lines, but in the end, I didn't need to. In situations like this, when you are faced with sculpted elements that are super shallow and really, really tiny and intricate, what you can do to pick them out is to apply really thick paint on your brush. So without dilution, you just dip it into the paint and then remove most of it on a paper towel, and then use the brush almost like a dry brush. Just running it very softly over the surface, making sure that you apply very, very little pressure, and then it should naturally just pick out the sculpted detail and the lines. If you find that the paint is running into the crevices in between the details, then that means that you have either too much paint on your brush, too diluted, or you're applying too much pressure. So try to change these things around. Next, I used light brown and only picked out, let's say, 70% of the previous elements and most of the stuff that is on the top, so towards the light. Also note that just like deep brown, this has a lot of orange in it. If you look at the color, it almost looks orangish, and that's intentional. I actually wanted to have it like this. When you pick highlight colors, it's very important to maintain the same kind of tone. So you either just start brightening up the same original one, like I did with the skin tones, or you pick different colors but with similar attributes, for example, once again with orange in them, but lighter and lighter. After the second highlight, honestly, you can just leave it at that, but I decided to go further and I mixed in a little bit of ice yellow into my light brown and used that to highlight only very few of the edges and a little bit of the grain. Okay, let's go back to my favorite guy with the flail and do something about those bandages. I wanted these to look like dirty rags, but still kind of whitish, so these need to be desaturated contrary to everything else. I used deck tan first to highlight all the edges and then apply a couple of scratches here and there. On some of the bandages I created some highlights inside the edges as well because I felt that they are a bit too dirty maybe for my liking. I wanted them to stick out a bit more. And if you're wondering where to put these highlights, it's super easy because the original shading already created the map for us. So wherever the shade left the brightest highlight is where you put yours, and ideally inside of that. I went a little bit lazy here and used the same color to highlight also some of the other elements that some of the other rats have. For example, on the staff, one of them has this paper bit dangling, and there are a couple of little bits sticking out of the book. Finally, I used off-white to highlight it further, but making sure that I only highlight some of the upper-facing edges once again and only the most prominent ones. I found highlighting the tails a bit tricky because first I used intense pink to highlight all the rings of the tail. Basically, simply edge highlighting all the edges of every single ring that constitutes the tail. Then I highlighted it further with pastel pink. But the end result looked a little bit too washed out and white in the end, contrary to the really nice, vibrant color that I had originally. Maybe I chose the wrong colors, maybe it was a bit too white, and maybe I was just a bit too hasty with my highlighting because, let's be honest, all of these little ringlets, they are a bit tedious to highlight. But don't worry, we can actually take advantage of that and bring it back to where I want it to be. I simply thinned down a little bit of voluptuous pink, the one that we originally used to paint the tails, and then just painted it over the already established highlights. The thin down paint is translucent enough that you will still see the highlights, but it will bring back the nice saturated colors. Next, I wanted to emphasize that non-metallic effect that we achieved with Basilicanum Grey originally. For this, I needed to just pick out the edges a bit more because that's what would happen on a non-metallic surface, the edges would be super bright. I used pale grey for this, and you might be thinking that this is a really big jump in terms of brightness, and that's true, but because we want to create this non-metallic surface, there has to be a lot of contrast there. So I highlighted most of the edges with this and also created some tiny highlights inside those edges. If you want to make this look like somewhat believably metallic, we need to make sure that this is the most contrasty and the most bright spot on the models. Next, I used off-white to create all the brightest spots on the metal. Yes, this is the same off-white that I used elsewhere on the models as well, for example on the bandages, but there the actual jump in contrast is much lower than the ones here, because here it goes from black to white, whereas on the bandages it goes from a light brown to a white. The trick is to make sure that you only paint this inside the pale gray that you already established and you don't cover all of it. Also, it's a good practice to create something like a light source. So if you notice what I'm doing, I am applying this only on one side of the edges, meaning that the light is coming from that side, and leave the other side of the edges completely dark. You can see this clearly on the chains, where on the upper facing edge I applied this light, but on the downward facing edges it's completely dark. And if you feel that you went a little bit too far with the brightness and it's a bit unnatural on a model that's supposed to be somewhat dark, then you can just water down some Basilicanum Grey and paint it over it. Done correctly, this actually will knock down the effect and make it a little bit more integrated into the rest of the surface. Let's do the same thing with the bronze color as well. For this, I switched to Scale 75 Mars Orange. There is no particular reason for this, I just really like this color for bronze. I created the brighter highlights by adding ice yellow into the Mars Orange. The idea here is the same as with the iron non-metallic that we did before. You want to have a big jump in brightness between the previous colors, so don't be afraid to add a lot of ice yellow into this. You can switch to a pure ice yellow for your final highlights. And don't forget about some of the grating that is on the bases. I was nearing the end of the highlighting process, so I thought that it's time to paint in some of the bases as well. So I used a little bit of emerald from AK Interactive to highlight the sludge that two of the models have. I used a bit of mint green for the final highlights. Then I took some gloss varnish and really thickly applied it over the surface. Combined with the sculpted details and the highlights, this will make it look like it's a liquid and it's flowing. Now on to the fun details. I highlighted the warpstone with the same colors that I also used for the robes. But of course the overall effect is going to look much different because the base color, which was orc flesh, is much different from the original plague bearer's flesh that you had on the robes. I outlined every single edge with pistachio. Then I used lemon yellow on only the upper facing edges and only, let's say, 60% of them. Finally, I mixed in some ice yellow and highlighted only the edges on the top of the crystal. At first I used some buff from AK Interactive to highlight all the teeth, the nails and also the horns, and then highlighted them a little bit more with ice yellow. And before I moved on to the bases, there was one more thing I needed to do. I needed to highlight our favorite little rat. So I took reddish grey from AK Interactive and started to paint in small strands of hair on all of his upper facing surfaces. This is easier than you think, you just have to apply really tiny scratches on these surfaces. I highlighted his body further with mixing in some deck tan into the reddish grey. The reasoning for these colors was that I wanted to use something warmer to differentiate it from the stones around it, where I wanted to use something more bluish. And for the stones on the bases, I wanted to use something bluish so that they are different from all the non-metallics because they share the same undertone, which was Basilicanum Grey. And with that, I was basically done, but I wanted to do one more thing to make it look a little bit better. Unfortunately, Citadel contrast paints are quite glossy, and I don't like glossiness on the model, at least not everywhere. So I used some matte varnish and applied it on mostly the upper facing parts of the models. With this, I removed most of the glossiness of the models, but I kept some of it in the shadows, which created this nice effect on top of everything else. And with that, the only thing left to do was to paint in all the base rims black, and the models were done. And the end result looks something like this.
I'm not gonna lie, this actually took me way longer than I anticipated. I was done with the original contrast paint scheme in like 2 hours or so, which is not too bad, but then the highlights took me another 8 at least. But this warband is just so damn cool, I think it was definitely worth it. If you're already spending time on just a small amount of models, you might as well just make them really pretty. Or disgusting in this case, right? So I think they are both pretty and disgusting. But what do you think? Is it worth spending this much time on a warband? And what is your limit? Do you spend just 2 hours on the entire warband, or maybe more time on a single model than I spent on the entire group? Let me know in the comments below. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching the video. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you learned something useful. If you did, please consider giving it a like and a subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and see you in the next one.